Hi everybody, my name's Amanda. I am a hand embroidery artist, and in this tutorial I wanted to share with you some of the basics of cross stitch. I haven't done a ton of cross stitch videos. I traditionally lean towards thread painting and surface embroidery, but in the past couple of years I've really enjoyed cross stitching, especially while watching TV and just kind of unwinding at night. I feel like it's really meditative, and so I wanted to share with you some of the tips I have and just some of the basic techniques so you can cross stitch as well. I hope you enjoy this tutorial, and please give it a like and follow along if you're interested in more embroidery tutorials. All right, let's get started. First, let's go over a little bit about the materials that you'll need to use for cross stitch. So the first thing you'll need is some sort of embroidery hoop. It's not necessarily required to use a hoop, but I find it a lot easier to have something to hold while I'm stitching. So I like to use an embroidery hoop. Some people like to use scroll frames, especially if you're working on larger projects. I would say maybe a scroll frame would be better, but embroidery hoops are very cheap and they're accessible at most craft stores. So definitely start with one of these if you don't have any of the supplies. The next thing you'll need is some stranded cotton. I like to use DMC floss. Most patterns are going to use DMC because it's the most widely available, especially in like the United States, and I think it's pretty widely available over in Europe as well. So this is the kind I like to use. They have hundreds of different colors, and I think that they're really high quality. So that is generally what I like to use. When I say stranded cotton, I want to show you really quick. So in a strand of cotton floss, there's 6 divisible strands, and this is important for cross stitch because you're only going to be using 1 to 2 at a time. Generally, I like to use 2 on 14 count Aida. So that is why you'll want something that's divisible. You want it to be a little bit thinner of a thread. The next thing that you'll need is some sort of thread snips or embroidery scissors. I like to have a little embroidery scissors that I can grab to snip off the thread. I think it's a lot easier than using like a big pair of scissors. And then you'll also need a blunt needle called a tapestry needle. These needles have a blunt tip on them as opposed to sewing needles and embroidery needles that have a sharper tip. You don't need embroidery needles per se for this particular tutorial. If you're going to be doing things like French knots, which some patterns will require, then you will need some embroidery needles because sometimes you'll have to pierce through the fabric. But generally, tapestry needles are what you will use the majority of the time for cross stitch. Finally, you'll need some sort of fabric. For beginners, I recommend starting out with Aida fabric. This is a stiff fabric that has visible holes in it, and it's really easy to use for beginners because it's a lot more easy to see the holes in the fabric. You're going to be counting all of the threads and all of the stitches that you're making. So I feel like starting out with something that's a little bit bigger and more obvious is a lot easier and less frustrating. Some people will use linen or even weave fabric. That is another option that you can use, but generally linen and even weave fabrics have a smaller, tighter weave to them. So you'll normally have to make your stitches across 2 threads, and it's just a little bit more complicated to keep track of. So if you have Aida, or you're willing to start with something a little bit easier, I would definitely recommend Aida fabric. For this example, I'm going to be using 14 count Aida because I think it's a little bit easier to see for beginners. As you can see here, the weave of the fabric is very obvious. There's basically little fabric blocks or squares that make up the fabric. So it makes it super easy to see which holes you need to go down into. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and separate out 2 strands of floss. This is generally what I work with. I think it allows for proper coverage of the Aida fabric, and it's not too chunky and it's also not too thin. Depending on the count of fabric you're using and maybe even the type of fabric, you may end up kind of switching around, and sometimes patterns will have different requirements, but for the most part, I usually just stick with 2 if it doesn't say. So I went ahead and threaded my needle. I'm using a tapestry needle. This has a blunt tip on it because I'm not going to be splitting the fabric at all. I'm going to be going down into the natural holes of the fabric. To start your stitch, I personally like either leave a tail or a loop start. So first I'm going to show you just how to leave a tail on the back of your fabric, and then I'll go over how to do a loop start. What you'll do is you'll come up through the back of the fabric, and I just like to use my middle finger and just secure a couple inches of tail along the back. You want it to be long enough to where you can tuck it in later. So you want it to be at least a few inches long. To make a standard cross stitch, you're going to take your needle and you're going to go to the top corner of whichever square you chose to start with. You can make this in either direction, so if you want the slant to go backwards, you can, or if you want the slant to be forwards like I'm about to do, that's fine too. This is a half cross stitch, so to complete it, I'm just going to go into the bottom right corner here in that same square, and then I am going to go to the top left corner with my needle and thread, and then I'll pull it through. So generally when you start one way, you want to keep going that way. It makes your stitches look a lot neater. So whichever stitch you made first, you'll start with that for every subsequent stitch. So for example, I went from the bottom left to the top right first, so I will continue making them in that order. So I'm going to show you a little bit closer what's going on, just in case it's a little too far away. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go up from the bottom left, and I will make a stitch to the top right, and that will be the half stitch. And then to complete it, I'm going to go down to the bottom right here, and then to the top left. Again, I'm going to start in the bottom left corner, go to the top right, and start in the bottom right corner, and then make another slanted stitch to the top left. And those are basic cross stitches. You can do an entire pattern full of just these cross stitches, but sometimes there's a few little variations, so I wanted to quickly go over those. They might sound a little intimidating, but they're really not. So I quickly wanted to go over fractional stitches. I'm not going to be covering every single one, but I wanted to cover the common ones because they're actually relatively easy to understand, and sometimes you'll see them in patterns. So a cross stitch graph is made up of these grids, and usually one whole square represents one stitch across one thread for 8 of fabric. So generally, there can be 4 different quadrants if you have a stitch that's kind of a partial stitch. So I just filled these in with 4 different colors just so you can see how they're separated out. So sometimes you'll see a pattern that has maybe a little stitch in the top left quadrant. These are called quarter stitches, and all you would do for this is you would come up with your needle and thread in the fabric, and then instead of going all the way down across the stitch, you would take your needle and go directly in the center of that square, splitting through the Aida cloth. And for this particular one, it's in the top left quadrant, so for this square right here, I put one in the top left quadrant. If you see one in the top right quadrant, then I'll just skip ahead one square and show you. You'll come up at the top right corner of the next square. And then again, you'll go back down in the center, and this will make another stitch facing the opposite way. So those are quarter stitches. Then there are half stitches, which would just be half of a cross stitch, and that's a very simple one to do. You'll sometimes see those in patterns like this. And then sometimes you can combine the two together. So sometimes you'll see a symbol like this, and as you can see, it's filling in half of the square at a diagonal. So this is what a 3/4 stitch would look like on the fabric. It is just a 1/4 stitch and a 1/2 stitch right here. And how we'll do this is, I think it's easiest to do a little 1/4 stitch first, that way you don't disturb the other slant, the 1/2 stitch. So I go down in the top left corner and then go down into the center of that square. And then I would just take my needle and thread and make a 1/2 stitch across. And that is a 3/4 stitch. And just to make this really clear, I'll share with you one more example. So say you have a 3/4 stitch, but it's going the opposite direction this time. So this one, you would start by making your 1/4 stitch in the bottom right corner of whatever square that you need to do this. So I would take my needle and thread in the bottom right corner and make a 1/4 stitch right down in the center here. And then I would make my 1/2 stitch across. And that is how you would do one facing in that direction. So basically you just figure out which side of the square you need to fill in and fill it in accordingly with a 1/4 stitch and a 1/2 stitch. I managed to use a tapestry needle for these fractional stitches, but it is a little bit trickier to get the thread down through the thick Aida. So if you feel like it's a little bit tricky, you can always use an embroidery needle and then switch back to a tapestry needle whenever you're doing full cross stitches. Now that you know the basics of some of the cross stitches, I wanted to give you some tips about working in a pattern. So say you have a block of color, it's all the same color, and there's a couple of stitches that are all touching one another. You can work these individually and do your 1/2 cross stitch and then go back over it to make your full cross stitch for each one. But I find it easiest to make rows of 1/2 stitches and then go back through to make full ones to complete the stitch. So I will show you how to do that really quick. So first you'll just make some 1/2 cross stitches in the first row. And then we'll go to the next row. So I'll just work my way down here to the next row. And then I'm gonna do these two at the bottom here. And now, once you've filled in all of the squares with a 1/2 stitch, you'll just go ahead and go back through to fill in the full cross stitches. And I just work my way back up the row, just kind of snaking my way along each row and then working my way back up. I like to do this because it makes sure I'm not skipping around too much with my thread, which saves it. And I just think it's a little bit easier to work it this way. And there you have it. I like to do this way just because it feels more satisfying to me to fill it in this way, because it feels like you're going faster, you're covering more ground, but it also allows me to remember which way I like to make my stitches. Sometimes when I'm doing individual stitches, I'll accidentally flip which 1/2 stitch I make first. So I like to do them in groups like this because it just eliminates the possibility that I'm going to mix up which way they're crossing over. Again, this is just a suggestion and not necessarily a rule. If you make a few that are off and you don't feel like taking them out, I guarantee you most of mine have a few little mistakes here and there, but it will just look a lot more uniform if you try to keep all of your stitches facing the same way. To end a piece of thread on the back, it's preferable to not use knots, especially for cross stitch, because it generally will get in your way as you're stitching, and you can sometimes pull those through to the front. And it also eliminates any bulk on the back that would kind of show through if you try to frame something later. It's not as common, I feel like, for Ada to show that, but if you're working on a lighter weight linen, it definitely will. So what I like to do is just thread my needle with the tail. And then you're just going to take your needle and thread, and you'll just tuck the needle underneath some of the stitches on the back here. Pull it through, and then I just like to trim the tail really close to the stitches so there's nothing there. And I just like to do that for both sides of my thread. And there you have it. There's one other way that's really convenient for starting thread, and it saves a lot of time for tucking in a lot of the tails of thread, and it's just a little bit cleaner of a start. So instead of using 2 cut strands, I'm going to cut an extra long piece and separate out 1 strand. Then I will take my strands and just fold them in half. I'll take the side with the 2 ends in it, and I'm going to thread those through my needle. So now you'll have the 2 ends threaded, and then you should have a little looped end on your needle. What you'll do is you'll basically make a stitch like you usually would. So I'm just gonna make a half cross stitch here, and I'll just make sure to hold the tail in the back. And then you'll flip this over, and you'll just place your needle through the loop and pull it tight. And that will anchor your thread, and you can continue stitching. And as you can see, it eliminates having to secure that other end of the tail when you're done. And I just think it's a lot easier to get the tension right while you're stitching. I think it's a nicer start. So when I can, that's what I tend to use. For this particular example, I'm going to be setting up an embroidery pattern, a cross stitch pattern that I just created, and I'm going to walk you through how to get started on it and how to do basic cross stitches with it. So my pattern, I'm going to be using 14 count Ada. Before we get started, I did want to briefly go over the different thread counts of fabrics because that can be a little confusing, and it is something that you should be aware of. So Ada fabric, linen, and even weave all come in thread counts. Thread count is basically the amount of threads per square inch on the fabric. So a lower thread count is going to have larger holes in it and a little bit more visible holes in it. And then a higher thread count is going to have kind of a tighter weave with less visible holes in it. So for beginners, again, I recommend 14 count or 16 count. 14 count is going to be even easier to use. The stitches will be ever so slightly larger across the fabric. And 16 count is nice for beginners as well, but it's a little bit smaller, so it might be a little bit harder to see and make your stitches on. There is also other counts of Ada fabric, but generally I feel like to keep your projects a decent size, larger or smaller, most patterns call for like 14 or 16 count. I did quickly want to share with you a little hack in case you have a different thread count fabric and you want to know what the finished dimensions of a particular pattern would be if it doesn't specify. So for this pattern here, I've made this little fox reading a newspaper. I'm going to stitch this, and it requires 14 count Ada, but so the finished dimensions with 14 count is 8 by 8 inches. But if you don't have 14 count Ada and you're interested in maybe using like 16 count Ada, that is possible to do. So all you'd have to do is take a look at your pattern. Mine is actually in portions right now, but there are little numbers on the corners telling you the total amount. So this has 112 stitches across and 112 stitches vertically. So it's a complete square. So all I would have to do, I have my calculator here, I would just divide 112 divided by 16, which if I stitch this on 16 count Ada would be 7 inches by 7 inches. So the finished dimensions would be slightly smaller, but it would still be a decent size if I used 16 count Aida. So that's all you'd have to do if you're interested in resizing the pattern. The reason I go over this is because it's really important to make sure you have enough fabric for the design. Unlike surface embroidery where you could just shrink the design or design something directly on the fabric, for cross stitch you'll be following this chart, and this chart is a fixed dimensions depending on the thread count of your fabric. So it's really important that you make sure to do the math and get the correct size and cut the right amount of fabric before you get started. So I have a pretty large piece of Aida fabric here. I want to stitch it on this nice dark green fabric, but I am going to use an 8-inch embroidery hoop, and the finished dimension of the design is 8 by 8. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut off a little bit of the edge of this, but I'm gonna leave myself a generous amount of fabric. So I'm gonna measure this really quick. This fabric is 12 inches. So I think what I'm gonna do is cut 12 by 12. So that way I have a few inches on the side. This will make it to where I can frame it or finish it in an embroidery hoop really easily, and I won't have to worry about running out of fabric that way. So I've cut my fabric into a square that will easily fit my embroidery hoop on it. And I'm going to set that aside for a moment, and I'm going to go over a little bit about how to read a cross stitch pattern. So I create my designs in a variety of different softwares, and most patterns are going to be very similar in the sense that they have symbols and colors or both for the design, and they're also created on a grid like this. So this grid, there's bold lines for every 10 stitches for this particular design. Sometimes you'll see them in like every 5. It depends on the pattern. You can change the settings in the pattern, but I generally like to keep it every 10. I think that's easier to keep track of. So it just makes it a lot easier to reference, to make sure you're making the right amount of stitches and to make sure that you're working in the right area. Most patterns are going to be labeled with numbers, so it'll be really easy to figure out where you need to go. And then they also have all of these symbols and colors. I prefer to work off of a pattern that has both symbols and colors because black and white symbols can get kind of confusing to look at. So I generally like to have both. There's generally going to be a key to follow. So for instance, all of these are labeled with colors and symbols, and it shows you the color code right here for each DMC color that is used in this pattern. So since I'm stitching on 14 count Aida, I'm going to be using 2 strands of floss, and I'm going to first orient myself to where the middle of the pattern is. So if you flip through the pattern here, I'm going to find the sheet that has little arrows on it right here. And there's an arrow on the side and there's an arrow right here. Some of them have arrows, just to show you. This one has an arrow right here because this is the middle of the vertical part of the pattern. But I want to select the one that has both on it because I want to make sure that I'm centering this design on the fabric so I don't run out of room on any of the sides of fabric. So in order to start this pattern, I'm going to follow these arrows, and you don't have to be like exact to the dot, but it is helpful to try your best to kind of run your fingers along and find the very center here. So the center would be this square right here. I'm just gonna mark it with a pen so I know that I need to start right here. And if you look really closely, there's actually a light X on there to verify that that is the center of the pattern. So that is where we're going to get started. So I'm just going to keep the key available and this part of the pattern available. And now I'm going to go ahead and find the center of this piece of fabric. Again, it's helpful to have a pen. This is heat erasable, and generally it'll be covered up anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But you'll want to mark the center of the fabric so you know where to start on your fabric. So what I like to do, it doesn't have to be exact like I said, but close enough. So you're going to fold it in half one way, and then you're going to fold the fabric again in half again. And I want to make sure that this is as straight as possible along the threads of the fabric. So the center of the fabric is going to be where these lines intersect. So I'm just going to mark right there. So I know that's the center of the fabric, because once I put it in the hoop, you're not going to be able to see the creases as well. So next I'm going to place the fabric in the hoop. And unlike surface embroidery with like thinner fabrics, I don't really think it matters as much to keep the fabric super tight. I more so like this just to like keep the edges out of the way and have something to hold. So you don't have to really make the aided fabric super tight, but you do have to loosen the hoop a lot because it can be hard to fit around this thicker fabric. So I have hooped my fabric and I have my pattern pulled up, and I went ahead and grabbed the first color to use, which is the first stitch here. So for this pattern, I'm going to be using 1 stitch per square on this pattern. And we already went over the colors and symbols, so I just have the legend available here to make sure that I know which stitch to use and which color to use. For this particular pattern, I'm only going to be using whole cross stitches. So I like to work my way around the pattern from one area to the next. I don't like to skip around a ton because it can be kind of hard to keep track of where you're going. So I recommend trying to work a particular color, one color at a time in one area, and then, you know, if you filled in most of the color, you can skip to the next color, but just keep in the general vicinity of the area that you started and just work your way out from there. I think that makes it a lot easier and you don't get lost in the pattern as much. So now I'm gonna go ahead and move on to this color right here and just do some of this area right here with the gray. I don't want to skip around too much, but when you have stitches already surrounding this area, you can kind of use them as landmarks for the next color. So this way I can just kind of gradually work out from this area. I did also want to mention that gridding your fabric is really helpful. I didn't do it for this tutorial just because I didn't want to overload you with information, but I'm going to link a tutorial on how to do that. You basically just mark your fabric similar to how the cross stitch pattern has grid lines, and it makes it a lot easier to reference your chart. I like to periodically take a look at the chart and just make sure that I'm following it correctly. I make mistakes all the time with cross stitch, so if you miscount, it's totally fine. It's easy if you catch it sooner, but if you are way past the point of removing a bunch of stitches, you can stitch over the squares with the color that you need if it's like a small mistake or a couple of squares. But I just like to, every probably like 10 squares, 10, 20 squares, I just reference the chart and just double check everything. I actually did have to rip out a few of these stitches and redo some of the gray area. So it does happen, and don't get frustrated if it does. It's just kind of part of the process. But like I said, I try to not skip around too much. I basically did all of the gray right here, and now I'm just working on filling in a little bit more of the silver and white squares in this general area before I move on to I'll probably stitch the mouth after I stitch some of the surrounding area down here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. This is just scratching the surface when it comes to cross stitch, but I wanted it to be kind of an overview of all of the essential things that you needed to learn. I have a couple of other tutorials in regards to pattern making and cross stitch variations, so I'll make sure to link that playlist, and I'll definitely be making more, so subscribe if you're interested, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.